Rachel had long been accustomed to the fact that she couldn't rely on her husband in family and household matters. It wasn't because Michael spent most of his time at home and didn't work anywhere, but because he didn't care about his family in the least. The man could lie on the couch for hours watching soccer on TV. Meanwhile, Michael had little interest in the fate of his 3 children, Peter, Molly, and Darcy. Of course, it wasn't the same when the couple had just gotten married. Back then, Michael worked as a manager in the office. But after Peter was born, Michael seemed to have been replaced. The excitement in his eyes immediately disappeared, replaced by apathy and a complete lack of interest in his family. It just so happened that a year and a half after Peter was born, the couple had twin girls, Darcy and Molly, who bore a striking resemblance to 2 blonde angels. Unfortunately, this fact didn't have any effect on Michael. At that point, he was feeling unappreciated at work and thought that he actually deserved to take a rest. That was when the family started facing some real problems. Since the family didn't have their own home, they had to rent a house in the suburbs. Unfortunately, the rent kept growing at a terrifying rate. "Honey, if it continues this way, we'll get evicted soon and we'll end up living on the street," Rachel said. "They won't evict us. They can't. We have too many kids. They'll just give us a warning at first, at least." Michael brushed his wife off. Rachel's eyes read desperation. If her husband had paid more attention, he'd certainly know that they had already received the 3rd warning, which the landlord claimed would be the last one before eviction. But how could Rachel get through to her husband who only cared about his own comfort? And if little Darcy and Molly couldn't fully comprehend what was happening yet, Peter already understood that the relationship between his parents was very strained. The kid didn't know the true reasons behind the problems, but he could feel that it had something to do with his dad's behavior. Torn between family and work, Rachel didn't know what to prioritize. Having 3 children, the woman couldn't work full-time and had to make do with 1/3 of a paycheck she would get otherwise. Of course, those were mere cents that were lost in a sea of everyday problems and difficulties that required more voluminous cash injections. Trying to incentivize Michael to finally start acting like an adult man and a father to his children, Rachel kept hoping that he would eventually get his act together. But no matter how hard the young woman tried, nothing ever changed. And then a new woman appeared in Michael's life, and that confused the man even more. It's hard to say what she saw in this lazy man-child, but the fact remained. Michael suddenly started caring about his looks and spending a lot of time in the city, claiming that he was out looking for a job, but the truth was very different. Spending more and more time with his new girlfriend, Michael completely lost his head and started distancing himself from the family even more. Whenever he came home smelling of women's perfume, Rachel naively thought that it was an accident and that her husband was still faithful to her. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be much worse than what the young mother could have imagined. "I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving you. As for the rent, figure something out. You're not a child anymore," Michael announced and started packing up his things. Rachel was so shocked by what she had heard that she even dropped the cup she was holding, which immediately broke into thousands of small pieces. "What do you mean you're leaving? What about me? What about the kids?" "What about the kids? In case you forgot, they're yours too. It's not like you can't handle," the man answered in a tone that brooked no objections. It was clear from Michael's face that he'd made that decision a long time ago. He was simply waiting for the opportunity to say it out loud. There are no words to describe how terrible the young woman was feeling at the time. Rachel looked out the window and followed her husband with her eyes. Then she started crying softly. Peter walked up to his mother, took her hand, and said, "Don't cry, Mom. Everything will be fine. Dad will come back, right?" Leaving her son's question unanswered, Rachel dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief and trudged into the kitchen to make dinner. Unlike her husband, the woman had someone to take care of, and therefore she had no right to let herself fall apart. Despite the fact that the family's income was extremely low, Rachel managed to save up a small amount of money, which she'd hid from her husband in an empty coffee can. Of course, it wasn't much, but it would be enough to buy a small house in the village about 5 miles away from the city. Rachel knew that the price of real estate in that area was extremely low, and therefore the chance to find something she could afford was quite high. The low prices were explained by the fact that wooden houses in the village were built during the Great Depression and didn't even have the basic amenities such as plumbing. Of course, it seemed unacceptable in the modern world, but Rachel didn't really have a choice. The woman couldn't buy a house in a good area, and she could no longer pay rent. Looking through the ads in the local newspaper, Rachel settled on a 4-bedroom house that also had a small barn or garage. The price for the wooden building was extremely low, which convinced Rachel that it was the right choice for her. However, when she came to the village with all of her kids to check out of the house with her own eyes, her disappointment knew no bounds. It was only then that Rachel realized that the pictures published in the newspaper were taken at least 20 years ago. In reality, the house looked much worse, which couldn't but upset Rachel. "Mom, are we really going to live in this wreck?" Peter asked with his childish innocence. Rachel looked at the owner of the house and lowered her eyes in embarrassment as she said, "I'll take it. Let's sign the deal and I'll give you the money." The seller smiled contently, but continued to persuade Rachel that it was the right decision. Frankly speaking, he was afraid that the woman would change her mind and refuse to buy the house, especially after taking a look inside. But Rachel knew what she was getting herself into and wasn't going to look for something else. Of course, inside the house turned out to be even worse than it seemed from the outside. Dilapidated walls, cobwebs in the corners, and a thick layer of dirt on the windows, which had long lost their former shine and cleanliness. The state of the house couldn't but depress its new owner, and even little Peter was so sad and lost that he didn't even utter a single word. When Rachel started cleaning the house, she knew that it would be a lot of hard work. It was the most challenging project she ever undertook in her life. It seemed that the mountains of rubbish and all kinds of empty cans would never end. Of course, being the exemplary son, little Peter tried to help, but it was hard for him to handle that kind of work, but his attempts sure made Rachel smile. The boy sort of looked like a dwarf from a fairy tale who was covered with cobwebs from head to toe and sneezed every couple of seconds. It took Rachel about a week to clean the house and put it in order. Naturally, she couldn't afford to have any work done in the house, so it all came down to cleaning and fixing the wallpaper, which peeled off the walls because of the high humidity in the house, making a rustling sound at the slightest breath of wind. The wallpaper resembled the wings of a huge butterfly that had just lost its chrysalis and was preparing to fly away in a new life. There were few residents in the village, and for the most part, they were people in about the same kind of situation as Rachel. The woman even got to meet some of them and share her story. The first person to speak to Rachel was Amanda Rogers, who lived next door and had a small farm that included a cow, a few sheep, and a couple of dozens of chickens and geese. It was Mrs. Rogers who gave Rachel a pint of milk, a couple of dozen eggs, and a loaf of freshly baked bread completely free of charge. "Here, take it. I'm sure you'll find a good use for it. I know that you're in a bad place right now, so I want to help out," the kind old woman said with a smile. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes. "Thank you very much. I'm not in a position to refuse any help." Thus, Rachel and her kiddos started living in the village. Life there was very different from the city and was mostly calm and unhurried. Since it was rather hard to find a job in that region, Rachel had to learn a new occupation. She got a job as a dispatcher, receiving and processing applications from clients of a trading company. Of course, it didn't bring the family a lot of money, but it was enough for Rachel to make ends meet. The most surprising thing was that during all this time, Michael didn't even bother to call his ex-wife or talk to the children. Frankly speaking, Rachel didn't count on any help from her ex-husband. He was always very irresponsible, but now he gave up on his parental obligations altogether. Unfortunately, the kiddos found it very hard to get used to their new living conditions. They felt as if their new house came straight out of a tale about Hansel and Gretel. Rachel herself seemed to have accepted her fate and even thanked heaven for sending her such a great neighbor as Mrs. Rogers. Not a day passed that the compassionate old woman didn't come to visit the family, always bringing a wicker basket full of gifts from her small plot of land. She could bring a couple of apples or a handful of strawberries or raspberries to the kiddos. The children were always happy to see Mrs. Rogers and ran to meet her every time she came by. Peter was especially happy about it, as he both loved fruits and berries. "Take your time, kiddos. There's enough for everyone. I didn't forget any of you," Mrs. Rogers would say, smiling as she put the gifts on the table. It's hard to say how Rachel's life would have turned out if something didn't happen in their neighborhood, which seemed to have nothing to do with her at first. On that cloudy and rainy morning, Phil Brown was in a terrible mood, primarily because of an extremely unpleasant conversation he had with his fiancée. Megan demanded more and more of his time, making it difficult for the man to focus on his business. "Honey, but I've already promised my friends that you'd come to the picnic," the woman said, pursing her lips touchily. Phil grimaced, looking at his planner, and shook his head. "No, not today. I have a business meeting with some partners from a neighboring city. I have to be there, and the weather isn't the best for a picnic anyway, don't you think?" Her fiancé's answer, quite expectedly, made Megan very unhappy. Tired of hearing her accusations, Phil quickly got ready for work and left the house. Since the businessman didn't have a personal driver, he always drove his car himself. The weather was bad, but that meant absolutely nothing in the business world, so the meeting was to proceed as planned. The roadway on that section of the route was rather bad. There were puddles of such depth that it seemed that an alligator could live there. Meanwhile, the rain intensified, which made it difficult for the driver of the expensive Ford to see the road ahead. Yet, no one's definitely going over the speed limit here, Phil thought, glancing at his watch. Soon, the rain turned into a real downpour, making it completely impossible to see the road. On top of that, Phil managed to hit a deep pothole with his front wheel, after which the car skidded and stopped in its tracks. Only then did Phil realize that he'd fallen into a trap that nature and the bad mood had arranged for him. The longer the businessman tried to get out of the hole, the more he got bogged down in the sticky slurry that had his Ford completely stuck. "That's it. There's nothing I can do here on my own. I need to get help. There's a house by the road. I'm sure I can find someone to help me there," Phil said, and raising the collar of his jacket, got out of the car. Despite the fact that the man had several million in his bank account, he always tried to solve his problems on his own and didn't keep an army of assistants and advisors on his beck and call. Even though the house wasn't far away, Phil still got soaked to the bone and felt like a wet chicken caught in a swamp. Having knocked on the door of the old house, the millionaire expected to see anyone, but not a little boy whose cheeks were richly smeared with peanut butter. Apparently, the kiddo had breakfast recently and forgot to wash up afterwards. Looking at the stranger, Peter smiled and shouted loudly, "Mom, there's a man here. He's all dirty and wet. He might be homeless. I don't think that anyone else would go outside in this weather, right?" Phil almost laughed out loud at such a description of him. But while he was thinking of what to say to the kiddo, his mother came to the door. Seeing the man in a rather unfortunate situation, Rachel invited him to come inside without further ado. And she did it without any fear or anxiety, as if she'd let wet and dirty men in every day. Seeing Darcy and Molly, Phil understood everything without words. Now, the unfortunate state of the house, which clearly was in desperate need of renovations, made perfect sense to the man. Meanwhile, Rachel found some old clothes left behind by the previous owner of the house and invited the guest to change into something dry. She quickly set the table, poured some hot tea, and invited Phil into the kitchen. The woman was so friendly and open that the guest followed suit and immediately joined her at the table. The man drank his tea and ate the donut offered by the homeowner, and it all seemed incredibly tasty. The two of them didn't even realize as they started talking. Being about the same age, Phil and Rachel quickly found a lot in common, although they belonged to very different social circles. Looking at this sweet woman, Phil couldn't help admiring her endurance and optimism. Raising 3 children alone, she behaved as if her life was great and she wasn't having financial or any other problems. So unlike Megan, who's always starting fights and claiming that she needs more money, Phil caught himself thinking. Despite the terrible condition that the house was in, it felt rather cozy. Phil had never felt so comfortable before. At that moment, the businessman mentally asked God that the rain wouldn't stop and that he could stay there for a little longer. But most of all, Phil enjoyed playing with Peter, especially Monopoly, which was the boy's favorite game. Looking at the guest with a smile, Rachel couldn't believe her eyes. She hadn't seen her kiddo so happy in a long time. The most surprising thing was that when Phil's partners offered him their help, the businessman rejected it and postponed the meeting indefinitely instead. Moreover, Phil called Megan and did something he'd been dreaming of for a long time. Having broken up with his unbearable, spoiled fiancée, the businessman decided to stay at Rachel's house for a bit longer. Phil enjoyed playing with the kiddos and taking baths in an old-fashioned bathroom that looked at least a half a century old. Rural flavor and difficult life conditions pulled the millionaire in and made him look at his life with completely different eyes. After spending a week at Rachel's house, Phil decided to stay there forever. 6 months after they met, Phil proposed to Rachel, which shocked not only her children, but the whole neighborhood. Some of the locals even said that it was just like the story about Cinderella, but the vast majority were still sure that Phil was sent to Rachel by heaven itself. Only time would tell whether that was true or not, but for us, this amazing story ends here.